Hi there. We're going to go ahead and wait just 1 minute here and get started. My screen should be sharing with you all in terms of going through our SAT score reports to help students say yes to the right test. I'm going to let everybody come on in and get settled. This recording will be shared out with you, but please feel free to take notes, especially if you have some follow-up questions from our team afterwards. We will be using the Q&A function during our session today, so you can drop questions in there. If it is something that I have yet to get to, I will let you know that the answer to that is coming up, and I will stick around for a few minutes at the end also in order to make sure that questions are answered. But again, we're going to wait just one more minute here to go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us. We'll get started in just one moment. All right. My name is Rachel Mead, and I am the president of Enhanced Prep. Many of you met my husband, Luke, at the Bellevue High School practice test fundraiser. He is the co-founder of Enhanced Prep as well. I have been working in the test prep and supplemental education space for almost 30 years. And one of my most favorite things to do is spend time with students and families, making sure that they understand the similarities and differences between the SAT and the ACT, know how to say yes to the right test, what questions to pay attention to. We're going to spend some time together going through the SAT score report from your practice test. We're going to look at those similarities and differences between the two exams. I'm going to give you some key takeaways about which test might be better suited for you or your student based upon what you see in that score report. Of course, we're going to provide some information about how enhanced prep can help. And then, like I said, I will hang out at the end for a few more minutes on question and answer time. But please go ahead and use the Q&A function here if you do have questions while we're working on our time together. So a couple of things that I do want to point out about the SAT. This test is different from the test that I took when I was in high school, the test that the parents probably took as well, for those of you that did take the SAT. Some of the things going on right now is there is no penalty for incorrect answers. So students want to make sure that they are never leaving questions blank, as making a guess is going to be better than leaving it blank since we don't have that elimination. I also want to point out that based upon the way that this test is designed, less than 10% of all students who take the SAT have enough time to finish every question to the best of their ability. Again, that is by design. So part of what we do here at Enhanced Prep is help students develop their game plan of attack. And we'll talk more about that as we're going through things. We know that these scores are coachable. We've been doing it for years and years and years and have helped thousands of students reach their goal scores, get those acceptance letters, get their merit-based scholarships. And I do want to point out that these scores, if it's the first time a student has experienced the SAT or the PSAT, and they haven't had anybody translate what the SAT or College Board is looking for compared to how it's similar or for the most part, very different from what they do in school, it can be disheartening to have a very high GPA and have the test scores not align. And I want to come through and really stress that a high GPA does not mean a high test score. There's very little carryover from the content that students do in school, especially those that are taking some advanced classes, and what comes up on this test. This test is very reasoning heavy. So, what are some ways that the SAT can be challenging? Well, first and foremost, we've got this whole adaptive piece that's coming into play now, and we're going to spend some more time talking about that. We know that it's digital, which means having an active pencil and keeping the brain engaged gets harder. The test writers get very obnoxious with regards to their phrasing and the trap answers that they put in place. Excuse me just a moment. This test is also scored on a curve, which means it's not just about how well the student does, but it's how well the student does compared to everybody else taking this exact same test. This test also isn't designed for mastery. And what I mean by that is when a student takes a test in school, it's on something that they've been studying. Whether it's a unit test or a midterm or a final, they've had some work up to that where the teachers have helped them prepare. And now the test is designed to say, come through and show us what you've learned. And that is not the case with the SAT. Hard questions are answered correctly less than 8% of the time. And we need to be ready for that. And we need to be prepared for what the test writers are doing to be particularly obnoxious. And then again, it does not align with what students have been working on in school. So the information that's needed on the SAT, well, there's definitely some content that is covered on that. It's the way the questions are asked and the traps that the test writers are putting in place that definitely make this more challenging. So let's jump into that score report. If this is your first time taking an SAT test with Enhanced Prep, then you're going to see one blue dot on your score report showing us how you scored on this particular exam. If you've taken more than one, you're going to see any of those other scores that are also coming into play as well too, and how your improvement is tracking test to test. From there, we have our two verbal modules, and that comes in with our reading and writing module 1, our reading and writing module 2. Now, there is a letter that is showing after the module 2 for both the verbal and the math, and that's either going to be an E for easy or an H for hard. And that designates how accurate the student one was in their first module in order to move into a harder second module or an easier second module. And we'll talk more about the differences between those as we move through the pieces. And then we also have our math modules here. Again, same thing, module 1, module 2. Some of the things to pay attention to is how the student did with their incorrect, their correct, and their unanswered, as well as that overall section score. Now, I do want to let you know that Enhanced Prep's SAT tests have been independently verified by a College Board advisor in terms of their certification for representation of what the students see on the official exam. So that's one of the big questions we get on all the time. How is this going to compare to what I see on the official? And I will tell you that it is highly, highly, highly accurate to what students see on the official. We also have some of our tutors that do take the official exam so that we can continue to keep our eye on what the students are experiencing as well too, and update our materials when and where we should be. Now, this is the part that starts to get a lot more fun and a lot more gives us at Enhanced Prep, our tutors, the ability to customize our programs for our students. What you see here is the breakdown on the verbal portions. Reading is broken down into two buckets. The first one is called craft and structure. The second one is information and ideas. We also have the grammar or the writing portion that comes into play here, and that comes into play with our standard English conventions and our expression of ideas. And you're going to see the total number of questions that the student got right, the first number in that second column, versus the total number of questions that were asked, the second number in that column. So in this example that I have here of the craft and structure questions, this student answered 13 of those 15 questions correct. With their expression of ideas, they answered 9 of 11 of those correct. Now, one of the really helpful things is this versus part. And what this does is this compares students within a 50-point score of each other, so similar score bands, and how they're using their time. If we're seeing something come in with a minus time, such as this here, this student got through these 4 questions 2 minutes and 26 seconds faster than their peers who had the same verbal score. When we look at it on the other side, for example, within punctuation, while this student did get 10 out of 10 of those questions correctly, they took another 3.5 minutes compared to their peers that had the same score. So, what that tells us is we probably need to find a way to help cut down on how much time they're using with those punctuation questions. So, while content might not be needed for the student, we definitely need to give them some good strategies so we can invest that time someplace else where the student needs it in order to help get more points into their point bucket as they're moving through this. Now, again, remember that this does take into account both Module 1 and Module 2 together, so it doesn't disseminate on the degree of difficulty on this part as of yet. Now, it's also possible that a question could relate to more than one category, and we'll definitely take a look at that as we move through our pieces here. But I do want to point out an example. So when we're looking at this information and ideas in the reading, we can see they missed a total of 2 questions. However, when we're looking at that breakdown, it looks like that they missed 3. It just means that one of these questions related to more than one category. And that is particularly common with the graphics that they're looking at either arguments and or conclusions with what is asked of the student to do in order to answer that question correctly. Now we have the same breakdown on the math. Math is split into 4 categories. We have our algebra, which is going to be the equivalent of first year algebra or algebra 1. We have problem solving and data analysis. You can see your graphics, your statistics really coming into play there. We've got our geometry and trig. Now, I know technically it lists this as trig with 1 question coming in, but it really is all about the student's ability to use their SOHCAHTOA relationships that they learned in geometry. So trig as a separate class or content piece is not needed in order to be able to master this test. And then the 4th bucket is coming into play with our advanced math. This is the equivalent of what students cover in their 2nd year of algebra or algebra 2. And then again, some of the separate pieces that do carry over could be story problems, those grid in questions, or when students can work backwards from those answer choices. Now, I do want to stress for a minute what we're seeing within the student produced response. You can see between both math sections, there were a total of 10 questions that were not multiple choice. The student had to come up with the answer to these questions completely on their own and did not have any answers to choose from with that. These are definitely challenging for students, and we can see that accuracy of 8 out of 10 coming into play for this student. And remember that those 10 questions are still going to fall into those other buckets of algebra, geometry, advanced math, or problem solving. So there's definitely going to be overlap there. Now, this is also another great place where we can help the student get specific about what they're seeing and what they're doing. So up top, you can see the color-coded bubbles that relate to those same 4 verbal categories that we looked at before. Again, craft and structure and information and ideas are our reading questions. Standard English conventions and expression of ideas are our writing questions. Along the first column, this relates to the question number. And again, we're analyzing both Module 1 versus Module 2. From there, we can see the correct answer coming into play in column A, and then we can also see what the student answered in column S. If it shows up with a checkbox, that means that the student got it correct. If it shows up with any other letter, we can tell that the student missed that question, and we can tell what answer they chose over the correct answer. Now, this versus par again is coming back and letting us see where that use of time was across all of these categories. Again, remember a minus means that they're slightly faster than their peers with the same score. A plus shows us that it took slightly more time than their peers in terms of that score. So for example, when I'm taking a look at question 13, based upon how much faster this student was, it gives me a pretty good idea that this student probably guessed on this question in terms of why they missed it. We can see that also coming into play potentially over here with question number 7 as well. They just got through that so much faster while missing the question. So either they didn't understand what was being asked, it was complex, they possibly did this for a time-saving technique in order to get to other questions, which is again a really important part of their game plan of attack. Now, the tags here relate to those categories that we saw on the previous page. So our verbal questions are always going to start with vocab in context questions. The number of those are going to vary by section and by test, but every verbal module always starts with that. And again, that VIC, if you look back to your previous breakdown of those categories, that part in parentheses, that VIC from our vocab in context, is how you can follow along with where those categories of the questions that the student got right or what the student missed in. So this is where it becomes so important that students not follow a one size fits all plan of attack with regards to their test prep, because the customization of meeting the student where they are based upon what are their strengths that we don't need to cover, what do we need to cover from a strategy perspective, but not a content perspective, and where do we need to spend the bulk of our time really helping them personalize their plan of attack for increasing their score. Now we have the same thing that does come along with regards to our math. Now keep in mind, again, we're going to see some of those math questions that do not have a letter that comes into play, but do require a number instead. So you can see those coming up. If something was left blank, like we see over here, that tells us that the student did not answer this question. But I can see they still spent quite a bit of time on it because they were only 7 seconds under what their peers were. So again, it really helps us understand what's going on with regards to the students' learning and processing. And then we have a big chunk of questions missed here towards the end of this section. This is a huge indication that timing was really challenging within that Math 2 hard module for this particular student. So we have to find some ways to help them get through those questions faster in order to be able to get more points in their point bucket within this second module. All right, so moving on to those scores. This slide is so important. I want to make sure that we understand everything that's happening here. We have to remember that, again, this test is designed to be adaptive. And what that means is it's going to put floors and ceilings on a student score based upon which second module they end up in. So what I mean by that, if they end up in the easier second module, the highest score that they can hit on the verbal side is a 520. So once they're in that easy module, even if they get every single question right in module 2 easy, the highest verbal score they can get is a 520. Same thing with regards to the math. Their accuracy or their score is not going to be able to break 520 in either one of these if they're ending up in that easier second module, which means a student will not be able to break into the upper 50th percentile in terms of SAT scores, regardless of how well they do in those second modules if they get on the easier module track. And so what that means is module 1 is the most important thing that the student do because it has such a dramatic impact on what's happening in terms of getting into that harder second module. Now, I also want to point out, if they get into the harder second module, the floor, so the lowest score they can get on the verbal is a 520. And then questions that they get right in that second module too are just going to be adding from there. So the floor and ceiling have that same score breakdown on the verbal side. The math side we see coming in slightly lower. So again, if they were to miss every single question in module 2 math hard, they'd be at a 460. But again, they're adding points to their point bucket as they're getting questions correct there. So until we're seeing a student 90 or more percent accurate in module 1, we are not focusing in on the question contents, question types, degree of difficulty that come into play in module 2. If a student is looking to break a 1500 or hit a 1500, they must be 100% accurate within both module ones, verbal and math, in order to be able to hit that score. The module one just counts more. All right, so let's take a look at what we're seeing in the timing and pacing. So when we're in that verbal piece, students have a total of 32 minutes to complete 27 questions. Now, right here, just by the count that we have the same number of questions and the same amount of time in module two, this is one way that the test writers are looking to mess with students' brains, because they get them conditioned with what's considered medium degree of difficulty questions and the timing and pacing that's needed with that in module one. So everybody sees the same module one and it has a medium degree of difficulty. Then they move into that easier track or that harder track depending upon that accuracy. But that timing and pacing from that module they just got done with carries over for them. But yet the questions are harder, which means they take more time, which means the student technically has to work faster in terms of what they're seeing when they're in that harder module too. Same thing happens with regards to our math. We have 35 minutes, 22 questions. And again, that timing and pacing is coming into play. There is one and only one break that the students see, and that's 10 minutes in between. That is the only time students can be using the restroom, having a drink of water, getting a snack. It's really important that students take advantage of that time in order to have their best brain juice and endurance for them coming back into those math modules. So you can see our total time of 2 hours and 14 minutes where they're getting through 98 questions. The pacing that they're having to carry over is fast. All right, so now let's take a look at what the students see within these. So again, we've got our two reading big bucket categories for you of craft and structure and the information and ideas. And we have those writing buckets. Now, again, one of the things that I want to point out is a reading point is a reading point is a reading point. When a student is in module one, every single question in module one has the exact same impact on the student. However, questions are not created equally, especially when you take into account that student's individualized game plan of attack. So if you remember back to the sample with this student, they did a fantastic job with their standard English conventions. They didn't miss a single question there. So a good plan of attack for this student would be, you know what? Let's not start with question one with that vocabulary. Let's go find that first writing question that has to do with your punctuation or your grammar. Let's start there, move through the writing, and then loop back around to the beginning of the section. Because as we get into these graphics and these claims in particular, as well as the text completions, these questions tend to be the most challenging for the majority of students. And again, this score report can help us get your student on that right game plan of attack. Where should they start in the section? How much time should they spend? When do they guess and go? What order should they be doing things in? Because the section is ordered in the same way every single time. Craft and structure questions, always in the order that you see here. Information and ideas, again, same order. And then on to those writing. So some of those easier questions or places that we can really help students save time are those research-based questions. We teach them how they can get through those doing a whole lot less reading and bank that time as they're moving back into their reading later on. When we're looking at the math, again, remember, while this says advanced math, this really is just algebra 2 or that second year of algebra. The trigonometry, again, is just the sine, cosine, tangent relationships that students are carrying over from geometry. So students that have completed Algebra 2 have all of the math that they're going to need in order to perform well on this exam. We should not be waiting any longer to get started with their prep if they've completed Algebra 2. If they're not yet in Algebra 2, we can still get started on the verbal side for them. Again, please remember that the spring of the junior year, as students are hitting those APs, those IBs, really working on making sure that their GPA is spectacular because it is the most important GPA that college admissions officers look at. If we're having to layer in an SAT or an ACT test at that time, it can get really overwhelming for students and cause some burnout. So let's get things done ahead of that as much as we possibly can. All right. So this breaks down what we see between the three different modules on average in the reading. I want to point out that what we see in module one does not have the same emphasis of what we see in module two. And again, module two is going to vary tremendously between that easier and that harder module. We can see how heavily vocabulary is tested regardless of which module we're in. And then I also want to point out when we're looking at those author's purpose questions, when we're looking at those text completion questions, those tend to be harder styles of questions. So students have more of them that they have to be ready for within that module one. But at the same time, if we don't have that main idea down from their module one, it's going to be hard to master enough questions in module one to move into module two. So preparing for one module is not the same as preparing for the other ones. We see the same breakdown within the writing side. Look at the difference with regards to punctuation, verbs, author's purpose questions. This is so dramatic depending upon what students are seeing. When we're looking at some categories like our complete, our pronouns, our modifiers, students might not even see some questions that relate to those depending upon which module they're in. So we really, again, we have to make sure that the student is prepared for module one first and that they're hitting a 90% accuracy there in order to help them maximize their score. And then we move into the emphasis and distribution of question types that they're going to see in that module two. We've got the same breakdown between the math here. Now, I do want to point out, regardless of which module you're in, functions are the most heavily tested concept on students within the math, followed closely by our graphing. We also see our word problems definitely coming into play. Other than that, we see a lot of difference as we're moving between module one, module two easy, module two hard. All right, so let's go ahead and transition and let's talk about what students see on the SAT versus the ACT. We're going to do some compare, talking about what they have in common. We're also going to do some contrast, talking about those differences. So again, one thing I really want to stress is neither of these tests has a penalty for incorrect answers. So students should never be leaving questions blank. With regards to the multiple choice, now remember, math is different as we're looking at that SAT, but there are a total of 4 multiple choice answers that the students will be choosing from within that. They cover the same range of math topics. The grammar questions look the most similar, and both tests do require interpretation of charts and graphs. Students are not going to be able to get away from those regardless of which test that they choose. So now let's pay attention to some of those differences. Now with the SAT, it's really important to understand that this test is only offered digitally. This can be really hard for students to keep track of their timing and pacing, what they're working on, where they are in the module, how many questions they have left. It does have some nice digital tools, but the elimination or the answer cover up definitely take a lot of practice. We're working on it on a pencil and paper style does not. Now, SAT questions are a little bit more dense, and that means that they have a higher need for analysis. Part of the challenge with SAT questions is students have to decipher what the question is asking of them before they can get to work actually answering the question. And this definitely takes exposure to lots of different types of questions, knowing the tendencies and the patterns that the test writers like to use, working on that decoding. When SAT says this, this is what they mean. And I do want to emphasize, because of the breakdown of the content that's covered, the SAT is better suited for students that have a stronger math skill set. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, when we're jumping into that ACT, students can choose to take their ACT pencil and paper or digital. We do recommend for the majority of students to take it pencil and paper style as it does feel more manageable. It can be easier to engage the brain in terms of long-term focus. However, if there are any students that have challenges or learning differences around focus or attention, the digital version may be better for them because they only see one question at a time and it can help limit some distractions. Now, here at Enhanced Prep, we do have both pencil and paper versions as well as digital versions. So if students are doing ACT prep with us, we do help them determine which test their brain and their learning style is better suited for. Now, in terms of the questions themselves, they have a shorter amount of time to complete the questions, but the questions are much more straightforward. The student is going to know once they're done reading the question what is asked of them, and there's a lot less analysis that comes into play. And this test is definitely going to reward students or be a better fit for students that have a stronger verbal skill set. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through it. Keep in mind, this test does have the optional science section as well as the optional essay. So there's multiple different versions of the ACT that a student can register for. So let's talk a little bit more about that format. So again, remember, while that SAT is only digital, it is also adaptive. And that also means it goes verbal, verbal, math, math. And we have the outcome dependent on how the student did within their first modules. Within that ACT, while the students can choose, each subject appears only once. And that works great for some students' learning style. Again, important to keep in mind what we're seeing there. All right, section ordering. This is a big place we need to discuss in order to help students say yes to the right test. Remember that this test is about the endurance and that long term focus, that brain juice, energy, grit, determination that's driving them through this long test, and what's happening to the battery that their brain is as they're moving through this. So remember when we're looking at that SAT, math comes at the end. Verbal, verbal, math, math. So both the brain and the body tend to be more fatigued when they're nearing the end of the exam. And that last module is hard math module 2. And that's part of why this test works better for students that have that stronger math skill set because they're taking both math modules when they're a little bit more fatigued, especially as they're moving into that hard math module 2. When we're looking at the ACT, reading comes at the end. So it goes English, math, reading, and then those two optional if they come in. So that reading skill set when their brain and body are more fatigued is definitely something that a student needs to lean into. So this is part of why we really want to focus in on, is the student better suited verbal? Is the student better suited math in terms of helping them say yes to the right test? We're going to talk a little bit more about this as well as we continue on with our time together. So, on average, the SAT has anywhere from 4 to 7 questions per module of the 20 scored questions in that module, or 8 to 14 questions for the exam of ones where the student does not have multiple choice answers to choose from, and they're free form response. Remember that these are going to be harder. While you technically can still guess, you're not given a 25% chance of guessing the right answer. And so we do have to put different strategies into play with these. ACT within the math has 4 answer choices as well, and it is only multiple choice questions that the students see there. So again, stronger math skill set. What does that mean? That SAT has those grid in questions. They're going to need that stronger math skill set for those. The SAT does have a reference sheet or reference information for some common formulas that they need to know. It is part of their online testing platform. They hit that reference sheet up there. I do want to point out that there are many formulas that are not provided there that the student need to know, such as the general equation of a circle, completing a square, the quadratic formula, discriminant. All of these are ones that are heavily tested, and the student just has to know these. The reference information is not going to help them. ACT, on the other hand, does not provide any reference information at all. So every formula must be memorized for students taking that ACT. Vocabulary. The SAT does definitely have a lot more vocabulary questions, and they also have to have higher command of the vocabulary, which means the word might be a little bit more common, but they have to be ready for multiple definitions or multiple meanings of that word in order to be able to key in on how it's being used from a context perspective. On the ACT, there are fewer vocabulary questions, and they tend to have much more of a direct definition that comes into play, a lot more context clues that the students can use because it's going to be in the middle of a passage. Charts and graphs, like I said, do come up on both tests. And the SAT says we are going to put them in the reading for you in addition to putting them in the math. The HCT says you're going to see them in math. And if you opt for the optional science section, that is very graphic heavy as well. Essay is no longer a part of the SAT. There is an optional essay that students can take for that ACT. Colleges may be looking at this. It could be used for placement. It could also be used for those looking to go into a writing or reading heavy major. So make sure you check in with schools in terms of whether or not they want to see that essay score. For any student that has successfully taken an AP exam, the ACT essay is going to be extremely easy for them. And it's one of the very fast things that they can work on mastering because of how straightforward this is. And it is about their perspective and something that is relevant to high school students. All right. Now, this is another slide we need to make sure we have good understanding on in order to make sure we're helping students say yes to the right test. The SAT is the sum of the two scores. Math makes up 50% of the score, and the verbal, which is again reading and writing together, makes up 50% of the score. With the ACT core, which is the ACT test without the science, it is the average of three scores, which means math is only 33% of the total score and verbal is 67% of that total score. So again, if we're seeing that stronger math skill set, let's focus in on the test that has more of the score dependent upon the math. If we're seeing that stronger verbal skill set, let's focus in on the test where more of the score is dependent upon that verbal skill set. So again, huge way to help students say yes to the right test here. All right, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here just to make sure you all can see this with me. But this is a copy of a student's official SAT score report. And one of the things that I really want to emphasize here for students is that when students take one of the 8 national SAT testing days, they are competing against international students on those testing days in terms of the bell curve. And that means the math bell curve is extremely steep because of the international competition. So notice here, when we're looking at the math, we see one white box. And as students are accurate, they earn black boxes, or the boxes get filled in is probably a better way to put this. Based upon the fact that there's an average of 13 to 15 questions in the advanced math here, and there's one box that was not filled in, that typically means that the student missed 2 questions within this category. Based upon the fact that we only have 5 questions, up to 7 questions in our problem solving and our geometry, that means the student had to be 100% accurate in both of those in order to earn all of their boxes. When I'm up here in the algebra, even though they're all filled in, the student might have missed one question here, maybe, in order to get all of those boxes filled in. But 2 missed questions, it's definitely going to go to a white box on them. So again, we see one white box here, and the student's math score was 690. So this can be really disheartening to students where they're like, wait a minute, the maximum score is 800. I missed maybe 3 questions and I got a 690. Yes, yes, indeed. That has to do with the fact that students internationally almost never miss a math question. So as a student, as soon as a student misses one question within that math, especially if it's in that math module one, then their score is dropping to a 750. They're missing two, and you can see what's happening with that. When we look at the same side on the verbal, we only see one white box here, but their verbal score was 30 points higher for the same degree of accuracy. And that is just the situation that students are encountering with taking their official. Now, if they have the opportunity to take a school-based test, a test that they are doing in school during the week, those bell curves are only based upon other US-based students that took that same exam. And we have seen scores anywhere from 30 to 70 points higher for a school-based exam that we are one of those international test day exams. So if your student has the opportunity to participate in a school-based test, it is vital that they understand the importance and the advantage that they have by doing so. All right. When we're looking at the ACT, now keep in mind ACT does have beta testing questions as well. For example, in the English, there's 50 questions that are asked, only 40 of those are scored. Students have no idea which 10 don't count, but it is 10 from one particular passage. I want to point out how steep the bell curve is for students within the English and the reading here. So if they're missing one question within the English, their score is dropping. Same thing within that reading. If they're missing 3 questions, they're down to a 33 for their English. If they're missing 3 questions in the reading, they're down to a 32. The bell curve for the English and the reading is very, very steep, which is again why we need those students to have that strong verbal skill set in order to lean into this test. All right. There is also a very big difference with regards to super scoring. And I want to make sure that we understand super scoring because it's a great plan of attack that can certainly help students. Super scoring says that as long as the student has taken more than one official exam, they get to mix and match their highest math score with their highest verbal score without them happening in the same sitting. So this first test that this student took, they got a 640 in their math and a 600 in their verbal. So that came in to be a 1240. They took the test again, their math score went up. Sorry, their math score went down, but their verbal score went up. So the super scoring says we get to take the highest math score, regardless of which one it was, and match it with the highest verbal score for a super score that is higher than any individual one sitting on the exam. Now, almost every single college in the US does super score with regards to the SAT. One of the things that I need to emphasize with regards to the SAT, though, is remember that the reading and the writing must peak together because they make up that verbal. So the student has to be exceptional with those writing questions for the same test that they are exceptional with those reading based questions. But we can still mix and match between the verbal and the math. Now, with the ACT, the English and the reading are separate sections, which means that when they're super scoring there, if you take a look at what this student did, we've got different exams that they're using in terms of achieving their scores for their super score. So English does not have to maximize the same test the reading does. And for students that have some learning differences or really need a lot of repetition, the super score can make a big difference in terms of how they're getting their traction. Again, here, remember that that science is optional as well as that writing score. So these two things do not play into that composite. So it is the English and it is the math and it is the reading that make up that super score. Again, this does follow standard rules of rounding. So a 28.67 would round up, where a 28.33 would stay at that 28. So 1 point and one score can make a big difference with regards to that super score as an example of what we're seeing there. All right, we get lots of questions about what's the difference between test blind and test optional. Test blind means that a college will not look at the scores even if they are sent when it comes to acceptance. Now, that does not carry over to other components of this. So, the UC schools down in California is a great example. UC schools are test blind. They do not look at student scores when they are deciding to accept them. However, they can choose to accept students into various majors depending upon their test scores. If a student's looking to go into a STEM major, they will not be able to declare that major going in without having test scores. When these colleges are looking at awarding merit-based scholarships, they look at test scores. So while they are test blind, there are still other ways that those scores are used. Another great example is minimum scores within the English. If a student doesn't hit a certain verbal score on the SAT or English score on the ACT, UC schools can require the student to take remedial classes. So they look at test scores for that, which could cost more time and more money in terms of what that investment is. So even if the student is looking at some test blind schools, we highly recommend that they have scores that they can use for the other parts that come into play in terms of how the colleges evaluate these. Now, when it comes to test optional, great examples of test optional in our area are UW, right? So when we're looking at these schools, it's important that the student understand that they are competing against students that are submitting these scores. So that's really important in terms of saying, hey, when everything else is equal, as we're looking at this, colleges are going to evaluate compared to other students that are submitting their scores. So students should consider those test optional schools as test recommended because those colleges want to see those scores. It is a benefit to the student. And you need to pay attention to the score being about the 75th percentile of what scores were accepted for that college the previous year. That's going to make you an extremely competitive applicant. All right. I do want to stress here that in-state, out-of-state, public, private, military, Ivy, and otherwise, every single college in the US accepts the SAT and every single college accepts the ACT. There is not a single US based college or university that cares which test a student takes. Um, they do not want a student to take both tests. It does not help their application at all because the college is going to strictly look at whichever one they scored higher in. So one of the questions we get all the time, well, what's the harm in taking both? There isn't a harm in taking both, but we do recommend doing that from a practice test perspective. Because for a student that cares enough to take both, what does that normally mean? They're going to put a little bit of time preparing into their SAT. They're going to put a little bit of time preparing into their ACT, and we're going to see minimal improvement on those. If we switch all of that time to one test or the other, the student's going to have a bigger return on investment for the study time that they spent. We're going to see a bigger score improvement with that. So let us help you decide which test you're better suited for if you still have questions. And then we focus all study energies on one test over the other. Um, Prepping for these is not the same. It is extremely rare that we would ever recommend a student switch test types or alternate. I'm taking an SAT in December and I'm going to take the ACT in February and then go back to the SAT. This is really going to mess with their brain and it's not a good plan of attack. That would be like trying to study their Spanish and their Latin at the same time, right? It just doesn't work well. These tests ask different questions. They have different requirements, content areas of emphasis, the patterns that the test writers use on what makes an answer right or what makes an answer wrong are very, very different. So we do not recommend taking both. Again, the vast majority of students are going to be better suited for one over the other. So here is one of our last slides about helping students say yes to the right test. Looking at this score report, if it is coming in where the student is 50 or more points higher in their verbal than they are within their math, that's a good indication that the student's going to be better suited for that ACT because we see that stronger verbal emphasis. If the math is coming in higher, regardless of how much higher that math score is, that's a good pointer that the student's going to be better suited for the SAT, again, leaning into that math emphasis. If the student is coming in with a composite of 1250 or higher, their brain does well with the way the SAT is asking questions, and it is most likely the better fit. Now, again, hear me say, if the student is looking to push to a 1500, they are going to have to be nearly perfect on the exam, which means there's no careless errors that come into play. There's no misreading of things. It is going to require a high level of work with that. And I also want to stress the best way to know which test a student is better for is to take that full length practice test of both. We know Bellevue is offering a test at home option for the ACT coming up here in December. If you're looking to get started with your prep earlier than that, we can certainly help you out with a full length ACT as well. When it comes to what we do here at Enhanced Prep, first and foremost, like I said, we take the time to make sure our curriculum is on point. We have our practice tests evaluated to make sure that they are representative and signed off on. All of our tutors have a minimum of 5 years of standardized test prep tutoring experience. We require that they all have at least their bachelor's degree, but more than 60% of our tutors have their master's or their doctorate. They know these tests and they know them well. They're highly engaging. They know how to help open up the student's brain to maximize what they're seeing. And then parents know that we offer transparency. You know what is happening after every single tutoring session with your student. You know what their homework is, when their next session is, and how their performance is going. We meet with you after practice tests to make sure we're discussing those results as a team and how they're moving forward with their plan. We believe in 3 pillars to help students maximize their score. Like I said, we have to know content. What are those punctuation rules? What are those math formulas? We break down strategy in terms of how to help a student get through questions faster without sacrificing their accuracy. And then we customize their game plan of attack. Where do you start? How much time do you spend? When do you guess and go? What do you move on to next? This is so important in terms of maximizing where the student is spending their time and energy based upon their own strengths, but also making use of the fact that the vast majority of students can't finish. So let's make sure they're getting the best use of time that they have. We do have small group courses. They are 24 hours of live instruction. We have some weekend schedules that are coming up here for our next round of exams. So our ACT is starting on December 27th for that February exam. Our SAT is starting on January 24th for that March exam. You can also participate in our double play, which gives a few hours of one-on-one tutoring to supplement what the students are covering within their group course. There is homework assigned after every session. The students receive the recording of the session that they were in, as well as the annotated notes, so that they can come back and review those pieces as they're working on homework and preparing for their next session. We do limit these to 10 students per class to make sure that we are able to meet students where they are with these. And then, of course, our one-on-one tutoring. So we do work hard on our tutor matching, which is something that other tutoring organizations don't have. We spend time getting to know the student, their learning style, their goals, their communication, their sense of humor in order to put them with the best fit tutor, because we know when they enjoy the person that they're working with, they're going to get more out of it, they're going to put more into it, and we're going to help deliver better results. We are extremely data driven, and we share that data with you on a continuous basis. In addition to your tutor, parents, you get an advisor who is your customer service person every step of the way, always there to answer your questions, provide the additional support that you need. And our students not only increase their scores, but they increase their confidence as a result of their work and the mentorship relationship that they develop with our team. So there's three questions that you should be thinking about as we end our time together. Question number one is, which test should I take if I should be taking a test? Question number two, what is the right timeline for me? When should I get started? And what official target test date should I be looking for? And then finally, what are you going to do to prepare? Some students could find that they are extremely close to their goal score right now, and working on their own is going to meet that need. Other students might need a group course or some one-on-one tutoring in order to take their score from where it is to that score that's not only going to get them accepted to the schools they're looking for, but also get those merit-based scholarships in order to help cover it. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pause here. Again, you will get a copy of this recording as well as the deck that I worked through. There are a few slides after this that do talk a little bit more about some of those changes in the ACT so that you can analyze those at your will as well. Again, many of you can be in contact with Luke if you haven't already. We can go ahead and set up that consultation in order to get your tutoring started or get you enrolled in one of our group courses. Or if you just want some additional help analyzing that score report in a one-on-one situation, please email our team, advisor@enhancedprep.com, and we will make sure to help you out with that and answer any individual or customized questions that you do have. But I'm going to go ahead and stop here. And again, you can use the chat feature or the Q&A at this point in time and ask me any questions that you have as we're wrapping up our time. If you don't have any questions for me at this time, thank you so much for spending some time with me on this Sunday evening. I know how busy student schedules are, and parents, I know how busy your schedule is keeping up with them as well. I appreciate you taking some time out of your night in order to learn more about how to help your students say yes to the right test and all of the various questions that can be answered as a result of your score report. But I will hang out here for a few minutes and answer those questions that you have. Again, either the chat or the Q&A is helpful. Otherwise, thank you again, and you are free to go. You are welcome. Thank you for coming. All right, I'll give it just one more minute here in case there are any last questions. All right, thanks so much for spending some time with me. Again, my name is Rachel, and I am the president of Enhanced Prep. Please reach out to our team on how we can be assistance to you and your student. Have a fantastic evening.